Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take complex anatomy, the kind that looks overwhelming in a textbook diagram, and build you a crystal clear mental map.
And today we are undertaking a critical deep dive into one of the busiest, most crucial structures in your body, the pharynx.
We're talking about a passageway, roughly 12 to 14 centimeters long. Structurally, it's a musculomembranous tube, and it's shaped, well, kind of like an inverted cone.
Right. It starts way up at the base of your skull and runs straight down until it transitions into the esophagus, right around the level of C6 or maybe C7.
It really is the anatomical crossroad.
It absolutely is. If you're visualizing this, you need to picture the moment the respiratory tract and the digestive tract deliberately cross paths. It's this beautifully choreographed dance.
And our mission today is to convert those dense, often static diagrams into a dynamic picture in your mind.
That dynamic part is key. The pharynx's width is never fixed. It's entirely dependent on the tone of its muscle wall.
Which brings us immediately to a clinical reality.
Precisely. That momentary drop in muscle tone during deep sleep is the root cause of issues you hear about every night, like disruptive snoring or, the more severe consequences of obstructive sleep apnea.
OSA, right. If the tone drops, the walls just collapse.
They do.
So, to orient ourselves spatially, this inverted cone sits just in front of your spinal column.
But it's not touching the vertebrae.
No, it's separated from the prevertebral fascia by these crucial areas of loose connective tissue, what we call the deep neck spaces.
The retropharyngeal space superiorly, and then the retrovisceral space a bit lower down. And when you look at the muscle structure, it really simplifies into two main groups.
Okay.
We have 3 sets of circular constrictors, which do the squeezing, and then 3 sets of longitudinal elevators, which do the lifting and shortening.
And those circular constrictors are the major players in pushing food down. I like to picture them as 3 nesting funnels, one inside the other.
That's a great way to think about it. They all arise from structures on the side of the neck and then meet in the middle, joining at the pharyngeal raphe.
And for anyone wondering about the supply lines,
The majority of the blood flow here comes from branches of the external carotid artery, most notably the ascending pharyngeal artery.
okay, let's carve this inverted cone into its 3 main anatomical rooms. They correspond to the passages they communicate with.
Right. The nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx.
And holding this all together is the fascia.
Yes, the connective tissue. Superiorly, anchoring the whole thing to the skull base, the occipital and temporal bones, is a dense, thickened sheet called the pharyngobasilar fascia.
Think of it as heavy-duty tape holding the top of the tube up.
Exactly. And then covering the outside of the constrictor muscles like a smooth sleeve, you have the buccopharyngeal fascia.
Let's start at the top then, the nasopharynx. It's structurally unique.
It is because its roof and its back wall are formed by fixed bone, the sphenoid and occipital bones, so its cavity is rigid.
And this is the only section of the pharynx that can't be completely collapsed by muscle action.
That's a critical point. The lower sections are purely muscular, so they can close entirely. This one can't.
And this rigid space houses some critical anatomy,
Absolutely. High up in the midline roof, you have the pharyngeal tonsil.
which you probably know better as the adenoid, especially when it's enlarged.
Right. And moving to the lateral walls, you find the vital opening of the pharyngotympanic tube.
The eustachian tube.
The eustachian tube. It's situated about 10 to 12 millimeters behind the inferior nasal concha.
So we have this tube opening, and that creates instant landmarks, right?
It does. The cartilage of that tube forms a prominent ridge or bulge, which we call the tubal elevation or the torus tubarius.
And behind that,
Immediately behind that elevation is a potential depression, a tiny but clinically important nook called the lateral pharyngeal recess, or the fossa of Rosenmuller.
and before we move down, we should talk about the lining, the epithelium. It changes.
It has to. Up in the nasopharynx, you have ciliated, pseudostratified respiratory epithelium for air, but as you move down, where food and air mix, the tissue gets tougher. It transitions to non-keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium.
That structural change really highlights the functional challenge.
It does, and it leads us to a clinical consequence. Nasopharyngeal carcinoma, a type of cancer, is notorious for spreading locally right along that pharyngotympanic tube.
And that can plug the tube, causing fluid buildup in the middle ear,
Yeah.
secretory otitis media.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets, really chilling based on the source material. How does it invade the brain?
It uses the nerves as a highway. It can breach that strong fascia and travel right up into the cranial cavity through the foramen ovale.
How?
It spreads along the perineural sheath of the mandibular nerve, V3, It is literally using the nerve's own pathway to bypass the skull base.
That is a frightening example of anatomical vulnerability.
It really is.
Okay, let's refocus on that pharyngotympanic tube. It's about 36 millimeters long, and it's divided into two parts.
Correct. The lateral third, about 12 millimeters, is bony. The medial two-thirds, so 24 millimeters, is cartilaginous, and the junction between them is the isthmus.
The narrowest point.
The narrowest part, yes. It acts as a functional bottleneck.
Functionally, it's the body's middle ear maintenance crew. Pressure equalization, clearance, protection.
But it's usually closed, right?
It's usually closed at the nasopharyngeal orifice. It only opens actively for a fraction of a second, maybe 0.3 to 0.5 seconds during swallowing or yawning. Just long enough.
And what's fascinating and so clinically relevant is the developmental difference here.
Ah, yes. In young children, the tube is shorter, it's wider, and it's positioned much more horizontally.
And that flat angle explains everything you see in pediatric clinics.
It does. It drains less efficiently, and infections can travel more easily from the nasopharynx right up into the middle ear. It's a huge contributor to frequent ear infections.
Okay, moving down, we enter the oropharynx. This chamber extends from the soft palate down to the upper edge of the epiglottis. And this is where the oral cavity communicates with the pharynx via the oropharyngeal isthmus, which is framed by the palatoglossal arch.
At the top of this chamber sits the soft palate, a mobile flap.
With a central fibrous core called the palatine aponeurosis, it's essential for sealing off the nasal cavity during swallowing. And hanging from its free border is the uvula,
Which can sometimes be congenitally bifid or split.
It can. Now, if we look at the lateral walls of the oropharynx, we find the palatine tonsils.
These are the crucial ovoid lymphoid masses, situated in a triangular depression called the tonsillar fossa.
Right, cradled between the anterior palatoglossal arch and the posterior palatopharyngeal arch.
And what's going on inside the tonsils? They're not just smooth masses.
Far from it. Their medial surface is riddled with 10 to 20 crypts, which are these deep indentations leading into the tissue.
And laterally.
Laterally, they're covered by a fibrous tonsillar hemicapsule, and the epithelium lining those crypts is specialized. It's called reticulated epithelium. Its job is to facilitate antigen transport. They're literally designed to sample the environment.
And this whole structure dictates the clinical risks of a tonsillectomy. It's all about what lies just outside that capsule.
Exactly. Lateral to the tonsil is the major vascular hazard, the tonsillar artery from the facial artery, and often a large external palatine vein.
So bleeding is the #1 risk.
It's the primary complication. But we also have to remember the nerves. The glossopharyngeal nerve, CNIX, runs immediately lateral to the muscular wall of that fossa.
And damage there, even just from swelling after surgery, can disrupt taste sensation.
It can, even if it's temporary.
Okay, now we get to the motor controls, the engine room of the pharynx. And this is where the pharyngeal plexus is king.
It is. It supplies nearly all motor and sensory function, primarily via branches of the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves. But to truly appreciate this system, we have to isolate the rule breakers.
There are always exceptions in anatomy.
There are. Let's start with a standard elevator. The levator veli palatini. It's the primary muscle that elevates the soft palate like a sling.
That ensures the nasopharyngeal seal during swallowing. And it's applied by the pharyngeal plexus. Standard.
Standard.
But then we hit the classic anatomical test question. The tensor veli palatini. Why is this muscle, which is right next door, completely isolated from that nerve supply?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the tensor veli palatini has two actions: tautening the soft palate and via its dilator tubae component, actively pulling the pharyngotympanic tube open.
To equalize pressure.
To equalize pressure. And because of that role and its embryological origins, it is uniquely supplied by the mandibular nerve, trigeminal V3.
An outlier muscle controlled by an outlier nerve.
Yeah.
That is a critical fact to retain.
Absolutely.
And who's the other exception to the pharyngeal plexus rule?
That would be the stylopharyngeus muscle. This slender longitudinal muscle elevates the pharynx and larynx, and it's uniquely innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve, CNIX.
So just that one.
Just that one. All the other constrictors and elevators like palatoglossus and palatopharyngeus fall under the vagus component of the pharyngeal plexus.
Okay, let's focus on the big squeezers, the constrictors. The inferior constrictor is last in line, and it has two parts.
It does. The superior thyropharyngeus and the inferior cricopharyngeus. And cricopharyngeus is the critical player here.
What is that?
It forms the main component of the upper esophageal sphincter, or UES. And this sphincter is tonically closed at rest. It's always contracted.
to stop air getting into the esophagus and prevent reflux.
Exactly. But its structure creates a literal vulnerability in the wall of the pharynx.
Right. This is Killian's dehiscence.
Yes, the space between the two parts of the inferior constrictor, the oblique fibers above and the transverse fibers below, creates a potential weakness. Killian's triangle.
So when swallowing gets discoordinated, pressure can build up and push outward through that weakness.
And that forms a pulsion diverticulum. The classic example is Zenker's diverticulum.
This complexity brings us back to the deep neck spaces, the retropharyngeal space behind, the parapharyngeal space on the sides. Why do we need to care so much about these seemingly empty spaces?
Because they are the primary conduits for aggressive, life-threatening infection.
Okay.
Infection in the parapharyngeal space, the lateral one, causes severe pain, difficulty opening the jaw trismus, and it displaces the uvula to the healthy side.
And if it moves into the retropharyngeal space,
Then the posterior pharyngeal wall bulges noticeably.
but there is a zone of maximum danger here.
Absolutely. The critical concern is if the infection pushes through the alar fascia and enters the so-called danger space. This area communicates directly and rapidly down into the chest
So an abscess can track right down into the mediastinum.
and cause severe mediastinitis. It's a terrifying anatomical vulnerability that requires immediate, aggressive surgical intervention.
Let's bring the unique innervation we talked about, the V3 tensor veli palatini, back to the clinical reality of obstructive sleep apnea. How does this all connect?
Well, OSA results from an overall reduction in muscle tone during sleep. The key dilator muscles that normally pull the pharyngeal walls open,
Like the genioglossus?
and critically, the tensor veli palatini, they lose their stiffness. The walls collapse inward.
So we have a system where the main airway protection muscles are mostly vagus controlled, but a key dilator that stabilizes the palate and tube opening is run by a completely different nerve, V3.
Exactly. When sleep hits and tone drops, the system essentially decouples.
And you combine that with anatomical risk factors.
Like a soft palate that's unusually long or thick, or a mandible that's retrusive or short.
And the airway just can't stay open.
The physical narrowing becomes too great to maintain patency.
Finally, let's wrap this up with a masterpiece of coordination. Swallowing. Deglutition.
A rapid, programmed motor behavior. The involuntary pharyngeal phase lasts barely a second.
But the choreography is astonishing. It achieves three things in rapid succession.
Sealing the nasopharynx, protecting the airway, and transporting the food.
Okay, the seal first.
The soft palate snaps upward to meet a ridge formed by the superior constrictor and palatopharyngeus fibers. It's called passivance ridge if that seal fails.
Nasal regurgitation.
Right. And simultaneous with that seal, the airway protection kicks in. The suprahyoid and longitudinal muscles pull the hyoid bone and the larynx not just up, but forward.
That action pulls the whole larynx out of the direct path of the bolus.
And it expands the hypopharynx to receive the food.
Yeah.
Then the epiglottis retroflexes, closing the laryngeal inlet like a lid.
And with that safety net up, the bolus is transported. Not just by gravity.
No, it's a trio of forces. First, the positive pressure from the tongue pushing back, the tongue driving force.
Okay.
Second, the rapid upward and forward movement of the larynx creates a momentary vacuum, a negative pressure we call the hypopharyngeal suction pump.
So it's getting pushed from behind and pulled from below.
And squeeze.
Yeah.
Finally, you have the sequential nested contraction of the constrictor muscles, which is the powerful stripping action.
And the final act is getting past that tonically contracted upper esophageal sphincter, the UES.
And the UES, formed by cricopharyngeus, has to actively relax just before the bolus arrives.
So it's an active preemptive relaxation. It knows it's coming.
That's a key physiological step. It's all about timing.
And to put a final bow on this, all that precise timing is necessary because of that key developmental shift between infants and adults.
That migration is paramount. The neonate has a high larynx. The epiglottis touches the soft palate, giving them a protected, continuous airway. They can breathe and feed almost at the same time.
But once the larynx descends to the adult position, the tracks cross directly.
And that requires the rapid elevation and sealing mechanisms we just described to prevent aspiration every single time we swallow.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, you should now have a clearer mental map of the pharynx. It's a three-part musculomembranous conduit governed by the pharyngeal plexus.
Except for the critical pressure equalizer, the tensor veli palatini, which is uniquely V3 innervated, and the stylopharyngeus, innervated by CNIX.
We tracked the spread of life-threatening infection through the deep neck spaces, and we appreciated the astonishing complexity of that 1-second swallowing reflex.
And we covered the anatomical necessity of that reflex, which is defined by the developmental compromise, the lowered larynx.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to mull over.
What does this increased risk of aspiration, this anatomical trade-off that requires such elaborate and fallible protective mechanisms by the human species that makes it all worthwhile, why did evolution choose the low larynx cross-airway plan for adults?
Think about that high-risk, high-reward anatomy as you review this material. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope your knowledge of the pharynx is now clearer than ever.
We'll see you next time.